Right, so there won't be much of me to see, that's fine, and for the best. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John. It's nice to be here remotely. It would be nicer to see you all in person, and I do hope that when all of this is done, hopefully in 2021, I can come and see folks in person. I can envisage that I might need a season ticket to go around the UK with all the various user groups that I've spoken to remotely and promised to come in person, but that'll be really nice. So today we are talking about my drum kit, which you can sort of see in the background. Now there's a slight problem that with my new monitor, every time I move my camera, it's really hard to get it back to where it should be. However, this is my drum kit. I've actually got another drum module down there that I can't easily show you, but note the bit that's out of focus and has lights on. That's what's called the drum module, and that will be the important, exciting bit. Now, the slightly tricky thing about doing all of this on Zoom is that I either have to share my whole screen, which gets awkward, or I have to share one app at a time and then switch between them when I do my normal switching between PowerPoint and Visual Studio. So forgive me for a little bit of disruption on that front. A few things around the point of all of this. Don't expect to learn anything significantly technical today. If you happen to be interested in MIDI stuff, then that's great, and you may actually learn something of technical use, but that's really not the point. The point is more to be encouraging. It was great to hear about the Mark saying about the project that's just about to start. So I'd strongly encourage you all to get involved based on what I'm saying today about how much fun it is, how much extra stuff you can get out of things, and then really maximize it. So just to add one bit of reflection here, this whole project has made me appreciate a bit more how privileged I am. And that's in terms of having enough cash to buy this drum kit to start with, and then other bits and pieces that I will introduce later on. Having enough time to then dedicate to building what I have built, the tools I'm going to show you, and then having a sufficient, I don't know, influence, reputation, whatever you want to call it in the industry, that I can say, you know, when people are saying, okay, being invited to speak at a user group is a privilege, you know, please respect that privilege, and I get to say, hey, I want to talk about this random drum kit that I've been building that's not going to be of any use to anyone, and it's a matter of significant privilege that I get to do that, and people trust that it will still be an interesting talk, when you could have someone talking to you about .NET 5 or, you know, Maui, or all the fun stuff that you'll learn more technically. So there's a certain degree of trust here from the organizers that I will still say something that's useful, even if it's not technically learning things. We'll talk a bit about some aspects of C# that I've been thinking about, bits of WPF as well. Frankly, it's always hard at this stage of the presentation to know exactly what's going to happen. Not in terms of will the tech work or not, because, well, that's always a problem, but just what will come in terms of questions and bits that I remember, oh, that's really interesting halfway through, and decide to go off on a bit of a tangent. So really, kind of, you have been warned. I'm just going to check the chat. So questions are always slightly interesting during Zoom things. Interesting in terms of process, definitely interesting in terms of asking me things. I will try to keep an eye on the chat. If people ask things in the chat and I don't pick up on it, then Mark, please unmute yourself and say, hey, John, you jerk, check the chat. And I will then do so. But really, this is trying to be, I hate the word motivational, but, you know, just think about things that you could do that aren't necessarily anything like this project at all, but stuff that you can do that you can then get lots of value out. Oh, I missed, one of the things that I'm doing with this is occasionally writing blog posts about it. So I'm learning tech, I'm writing blog posts, I'm presenting at user groups, I'm having a load of fun in terms of writing the code. I'm also gradually learning to play the drums. So all of this is good stuff, and it sort of feeds off itself. Okay, so I mentioned before, you've seen my slightly battle-worn drum kit that doesn't anymore look quite like this. This is a TD17 KVX, I believe, although it's got, interestingly, slightly, oh no, that is a straight KVX. Mine is now a TD27, which is another Roland. These are all Roland drum kits, and all of this stuff is specific to Roland, not because I have any particular affinity to Roland. It's just that it's the drum kit that I bought, and all the protocols are specific to this. So if I bought an Alessi Strike or whatever, maybe I could do something similar. I don't know. My wife is very forgiving on various things, but I think if I said, no, I'm going to start buying other drum kits by other manufacturers, she might get slightly more cross. So the important bits here are to realize that there are lots of drums here. I can't easily indicate. I don't think, oh, I might be able to. Yeah, you may be able to see there. That is the drum module. The bit that I've ringed in purple, and that's the bit that the USB plugs into, and all the other pads, everything else, the cymbals and the sort of mesh head bits, these are all called pads, and the kick drum, they all plug into the module. The module is responsible for turning that into MIDI signals if you're using I can't remember all the acronyms, to be honest, but if you're transporting the MIDI data to a computer that will turn it into really, really nice sounds, pretending to be a particular drum kit, then you could do that, or it will turn it into sounds itself. And that's what's more interesting to me, because there are so many different ways that you can turn it into sounds, or things that you can pretend it will be. And that was what really motivated the whole of the rest of doing this. I've now got to work out how to stop annotating so I can move on the slide. There we go. Clear all drawings. There we go. Right. So now I'm going to, now that you've seen the drum kit itself, I'm going to give a quick demo of what it is I've built so that all of the rest of the stuff makes a bit more sense. And I should give a little bit of background that I started thinking about this while I was in the shop buying the drum kit. I was with a friend of mine, Alice, who was encouraging me to learn drumming, and there were two drum kits that were available that I was looking at. One was a TD17, the fairly flash one, and more expensive, and there was the TD1, which was significantly more simple. Now, in terms of my drumming needs as a complete novice drummer, the TD1 would have been absolutely fine. So if someone wants to go out and buy a drum kit in order to play the drums, and they're as rubbish at it as I am, then a TD1, great value for money, all good stuff. However, the module on a TD1 is significantly simpler. It does have USB input, but it's not, it's not designed for really significant configuration and things. I think there are 10 or 12 drum kits on the TD1, whereas there are 100 kits on the TD17 and the TD27, and more importantly, there are hundreds of different instruments. I saw some of the configuration for the TD17 in the shop, where the person demonstrating it was saying, oh yes, you can assign different, say this is now going to be a maple kick drum instead of a whatever, a beach one. And I thought, well, that's all very well doing that from the small screen on the module itself, but what about if I want to do it from a computer? I wonder if there's a protocol. So I'm going to stop sharing for a bit, and I can't do this too often, I will start the application, and later on I'll have to switch to Visual Studio to show you the code. It's not quite as simple as it would be normally. Right, so this is where it's going to get slightly tricky, because I don't know whether if I bring up another window, you get to see it. So this is the sort of home screen. The important bit is when I load, in this particular case, I'm loading a file. So I'm not actually using the fact that I'm connected to the kit right now, but you can see that it says that I am connected to a TD27, and I've got device options of loading data and loading a single kit and things. You can use this without a drum kit at all, and that works fine. Let me just load the TD27, and hopefully, right, I now need to change the share again so that you can see the correct window. The Module Explorer. Okay, so this is just a tree view, basically. So you see all the details on the right-hand side and all the configuration on the left-hand side. So there's some setup stuff for how you want inputs and outputs to correspond. I'll come back to kits because that's the main bit. There are set lists, which is I want to go from kit 1 to kit 2 to kit 3 to kit 5 to kit 10, and that's the end of my set. So that's if you're a professional drummer and you want a different kit configuration for each song in your set, you come up with a set list and do the right thing. And then there are trigger banks, so you get to decide what your how your hardware is configured, because there are all kinds of different bits of hardware with different zones, and they're configured very slightly differently, and in some cases configured very differently. So I have a digital snare and a digital ride, and those are over USB instead of over analog ports and things. So trigger banks you would rarely need to change, but the majority of this is 100 kits. And what a kit is a set of configurations to say how each pad is configured, so what instrument each pad will play, and then also what extra effects there are, so compressors, and you can have various MIDI settings, and then what are called multi-effects. And I'll explain some of those in a minute. So as an example, if I'm currently on the drum kit, I'm currently on kit 4. I'm going to change to a kit that I don't care about, so kit 88, and if I just hit the snare drum, that does some random noise. I'm just going to move to kit 88 so it copies to the right place. So if I edit the snare head and say, I don't want it to be a steel fat snare anymore, I want it to be, let's say, a cowbell, and I copy the data over. So now, I don't know how easily audible that is. I can turn the volume up a bit. So that's a cowbell, and what can you change for a cowbell? You can change the pitch and some decay. So let's turn down the decay. Let's turn the pitch up a bit. And I need to copy the data back onto the device. So that's now slightly higher. And I can have a second instrument underneath it. So I'm going to have the sound of someone laughing. I think I've got a laugh somewhere here. Oh no, I've got an emergency though. Let's put the emergency on. And again, let's copy that over. And now I think I probably, have I not turned that on? No. There's probably some other setting that I need to put on here that will make it actually come on. There are so many settings here, I frankly don't understand it all. I can change this so we can hear what emergency should sound like. Okay, that's just a bit weird at the moment. I would need to look in more detail to work out what that's meant to sound like. Maybe it was on before. But you see the idea that there are all these things that you can configure, and that's just on the snare head. Then there's the same set of things on the snare rim, so 2 different instruments. So you can have the snare head sounding like a snare drum, but the snare rim sounding like, you know, a cymbal or whatever. So let's make it sound like a crash cymbal, and then the head still sounds that emergency or cowbell or whatever, and the rim sounds like a cymbal. Okay, a couple of things to notice, because I'll come back to them. When we're on a crash cymbal, we get this size bit as the main v-edit. So the v-edit is editing details about the instrument that you're playing. And if I change from, you see I've got size, thickness, muffling, sizzle type, and sizzle amount. If I change to a kick drum, now I've got a shell depth and a head type and tuning and muffling and whatever. So that's one set of the fields in the main v-edit depend on the main instrument, and likewise for the sub-instrument. Next, there's multi-effects. So as an example of this, currently everything's switched off. I have a different file, but then I'd need to switch the screen share. But you can select all these different effects, and you can have 3 effects per kit, and say which multi-effects each instrument is. So if I go to the ride head, I get to say somewhere where it is. I can never remember. Here we go. Yeah, the multi-effects assign. There we go. So for the whole of the ride head, both instruments, you get to say how much it's being sent to the multi-effects and which of the 3. So the whole kit can have 3 different things: a delay, a pitch shift, and an overdrive, and whatever. But each instrument, each pad, or at least each trigger of each pad, only corresponds to 1 multi-effects. But the interesting thing here is that we've got a type here, and that's just a drop down. But every time you change what type of effect it is, they all have different parameters. And I'll come back to that when I'm talking about the schema. I will demonstrate what difference the multi-effects makes in a sec. So I have a kit that has multi-effects on at the moment, and I've got the non-multi-effects version. Sounds like that's the snare drum and the tom 3. If I go to one that's exactly the same kit, but I've applied multi-effects in a very slightly silly way, we get a nice delay, and then weird sounds for the tom. So that's what the multi-effects sounds like. Okay, I will now go back to I see a question in the chat. I will talk to that in just a sec. Let me just switch back to the PowerPoint, assuming I can. There we go. Right. So Hannah was asking, how difficult was it to work out all the settings, or are these general MIDI settings, or is it specific to Roland? That's a great question. There is documentation, and this is one of the big things that I want to make a point of, is there's documentation. And if I just stop sharing for a minute, just as a sort of spoiler, this is documentation for the Aerophone. You can see it's got some scribbles on it. And the Aerophone that I'll show you later on uses the same protocol, but there are, you can see, I don't know whether it's reversed or not for you. There are bits saying, you know, this is breath control 1 and breath control 2 and whatever. It doesn't explain the meaning of things, but it does kind of explain that it's there. So it's half documented. And in fact, for the Aerophone, there are various things that aren't documented. However, the fact that it's documented at all is fantastic. And let me now show you what it is that they've been documenting, which is the protocol that this uses to talk to the drum kit. So I imagine the module as basically one big block of memory that contains all the information that we need to know for the configuration. Now, MIDI is an interesting protocol. It's a unidirectional protocol for each channel. So you get to make a connection that either receives information or it sends information. It doesn't do both. That's for MIDI 1. Now, MIDI 2 has come out within the last 6 or 12 months, and that has bidirectional channels, but I'm not aware of any instruments using it yet. I'm sure they will, but my ones don't, as far as I'm aware, and you would need Windows drivers and firmware that supports it, and yeah, it doesn't happen at the moment, which leads to an interesting situation. Most MIDI commands are things like note on, note off. It says, right, someone has played this note with this attack, which is, how hard you've pressed the key or hit the drum or blown into the clarinet or whatever, or stop a particular instrument or add some control to sort of pitch bend or whatever it is. And those are all standardized so that I might find time later on, we'll see, you can have 2 different instruments by different manufacturers. So I have an electric piano here. I know all of this gives the impression that I'm very musical, and I'm really not. It's just fun. I've got an electric piano and the drum kit, and I've written a little MIDI proxy that says, okay, well, whenever you get a note on or a note off instruction on one channel, send it to another channel. So you can play the drum kit via the keyboard or vice versa, because that's all standardized. Then there are what's called system exclusive or Sysex commands, and the idea is they're manufacturer specific. Now, there's one universal Sysex command, which is a sort of hybrid between the two. It's this is the one Sysex command that everyone agreed, hey, we'll support this, and that helps you work out which what devices are connected on any particular MIDI channel. But the 2 really interesting system exclusive commands, once you've identified, hey, this is a drum kit or whatever it is, that I use within Roland things, are the data request and data set commands. And only a very small subset of Roland instruments have this. Typically at the higher end, the lower end ones don't implement this. But these 2 commands are what almost everything in my code uses. So data request is sending out a request saying, I would like to see the 10 bytes or however many it is starting at the address foo, 1000, whatever it is. And you just send that out. It's a command. These are unidirectional. You don't get anything saying we've received your command, here's the data, or even it worked. You just send the command. So you sent that out on an output channel. On your input channel, you then get back data set commands saying, here's some data. Those are also the same commands that I use if I want to change the name of a kit, for example. I would send the data by saying data set this block of memory. So it's almost like it's a synchronization protocol, in that data set is used for both please set this memory and my memory is set to this. So it's a bit weird on that front. And because of the way that you've only got one channel, you've got one channel in each direction, but they're both unidirectional channels. It ended up being quite interesting writing the code to manage this, because you could send out 10 data request commands and get back 10 responses in who knows what order. And in fact, you don't necessarily get back a single data set command corresponding to one data request command. You can say, give me all your data, give me gigabytes of data. Any one module only has little bits. It's a very sparsely populated bit of memory. And it will say, well, I've got this bit over here and this bit over there. And so working out what corresponds to what is kind of interesting. The next problem I ran into, so I started off by writing a console application to see whether I could communicate with the drum kit at all, which is what I almost always do. And now my console app for talking to the drum kit or to the Aerophone is becoming a little bit more formal than it was. Initially, it was, well, here's a main method, do whatever you like in the main method, we're just playing around. And that's, I found a really, really good way of experimenting. But the first problem I ran into when doing all of this is 7-bit addressing. So MIDI is a primarily 7-bit protocol. The top bit of each byte of a MIDI command is basically used to say, this is the start or this is the end, or it's in the middle. So every data byte that you send only counts as 7 bits. So you could, if you think of a large address space, the way I would do it is say, well, I will think about this as a reasonably normal contiguous address space, and then just divide, make sure that if I'm sending 4 bytes of information, but only 7 bits are valid at any one time, I will consider that to be a 28-bit address space, and the top of that range is just going to be 0 FFFF. You lose 1 F-ness, 1 nibble's worth of addressing. Roland didn't go that way. They said instead, well, we'll lose 1 bit from each byte in addresses, so the top bit is always clear. And then you don't need to do any bit shifting or whatever. The address that you've got in 4 bytes internally is exactly what you send. That's the bits that you send in the request, and the top bit is just naturally missing, is always clear. That was a real pain. It took me several goes to work out a level of abstraction so that I wouldn't need to care about this. So I have the concept of a module address within my code, which is, it has a display value, which uses this 7-bit addressing. So effectively spreading out the 28 bits of address space across 4 bytes with 1 bit missing per byte. And then there's the logical address space, the logical value for any module address, which is compressed so that everything's contiguous. And I'm now fairly happy with it in that I don't have much code that needs to do arithmetic. It all needs to be aware of it and use either display value or logical value at the right time, but that's okay. I don't mind that. Hardly anything needs to do bit shifting and accounting for these weird holes. So I don't have anything saying, well, if I was writing 3 bytes starting with 7E, it actually writes 7E, then 7F, then 100, 101. And there are very few bits of code that need to know about that. So the next problem was what to do about the schema. So I had documentation initially just for the TD17. And my very first attempts were get this hard-coded bit of memory. And yes, I can get the name and I can change the name and this is all good. I then started thinking, okay, I've got this idea of this tree view with stuff you can configure. That's great, but how am I actually going to build that? And I started off by creating a class called kit, and then a class called instrument, and then adding some fields and things. And I thought, this is going to be very repetitive. We've got all this, any logic is going to be repeated all over the place. You saw we've got 100 kits. Each kit has 20 triggers. Each trigger has 2 instruments, each with their own V-edit. We've got the multi-effect stuff. There's rather a lot here. And in particular, I then looked at the TD50, which is the sort of big brother kit. So if you buy a TD50 module, that's sort of £2,500. a TD50 whole drum kit, you're looking at £5,000, £6,000, £7,000. These are professional grade. You will see these on music videos. If people are using electronic drum kits on music videos, it may well be a Roland TD50. It may be, you know, a Pearl Mimic or something, but TD50 is very professional. I don't yet have a TD50. I've been trying to get hold of a secondhand one at a cost that I can just about justify. But I did like the idea of, well, we've got these two drum kits, the TD17 and TD50, because the TD27 didn't exist at the time, and they have the same protocol. They just have different schemas. So the TD50, being a more grown-up set, had same number of kits, but more instruments and different instruments, same multi-effects, different V-edits for the different instruments, more triggers, all kinds of things were different, but the protocol itself was the same. And so that felt fairly clearly, I don't want to have code that's specific for the TD17, because then I'd need code that's specific for the TD50, and it doesn't really scale well. Instead, this feels like you create a schema and you work with the schema. And I can have a different schema for each of the TD17 and the TD50. How do you represent that? There are lots of different ways. I could potentially even have used protocol buffers. I didn't think about that at the time. It felt to me like JSON was a natural way of representing the schema. Not using JSON schema, I could potentially have a JSON schema form my schema to say, well, a field can have these aspects, you know, it's got a type, it's got a minimum value, maximum value, or maybe it's an enum, and these are the optional values, etc. But I had all kinds of things, you know, options for that. So there isn't a JSON schema for it at the moment, but there's a lot of JSON. And as well as, you know, you start thinking, how am I going to lay this out on disk? This isn't just one file that we have for the whole schema, because you look at the paper copies of this and, you know, you've got 50 pages worth of schema. It would be an enormous file. So I invented my own little kind of extension to JSON, so that if you want to include a file from elsewhere, you can do that. And that was relatively easy to do with JSON.NET. You just say, well, I will walk my tree of the whole of the JSON, and anytime I come up against a token, which is a string, which has the form $resource : something, then I will load the whatever token is there, which doesn't need to be a string. It may be an object or an array or whatever. And I will replace the token that says resource something with the token I've loaded. So that feels like a useful thing. XML already has this idea of importing stuff. I didn't find anywhere that has it for JSON. Maybe I'm missing something. I mentioned the documentation. This is what the documentation kind of looks like. So you see these addresses, and these are the 7-bit addresses. So you'll never see something starting with 80 or anything higher than 7, basically, as the leading nibble in a byte. And this is what I ended up calling a container, because each of the values in this container, this is the root container, and it contains a current container, a setup container, a trigger container, and 100 kit containers. Now, out of those, I happen to know that current is a field container, setup, I think, is another field container, trigger is a container, and the kit ones are also containers. So each container either has just fields, leaf nodes, if you will, or just other containers that themselves have other containers and field containers and things. So here is kit, which is also a container, as I mentioned. And out of these, I think these are all field containers. So kit common, kit MIDI, kit ambience, etc. And it's all reasonably well documented. And I'll come back to that. Here is an example of a field container. And this is actually the V-edit bit for a kick. So when I showed the demo earlier on, I showed that sometimes the values of a particular bit of memory need to be interpreted based on some other value. And that was a major pain because you've got to work out dependency. How do you make it so that when you change one bit of memory, it changes what's displayed elsewhere on the user interface? Because at one point it becomes invalid. The v-edit for a kick may be invalid compared with a symbol, for example. So that dependency management was really tricky, and the same was true for multi-FX. Although the tricky bit in v-edits, this sort of pitch change and whatever, is that here, which fields are present depends on the value in a completely different container. Finally, there were conditional fields. Now, when I first wrote this slide, I had the concept of just conditional fields. Here we have a tempo sync left, a delay left time in milliseconds, and delay left time as a note. And basically, the first of these fields, let me annotate stuff. Yeah. So this tempo sync left, if that is on, then it means use delay left time. If it's off, it means, sorry, delay left time as a note. If it's off, it means use delay left time as a time. So basically it's saying, is this a fixed delay or does it depend on the tempo elsewhere? And there's a whole separate field saying what the tempo is at the moment. And I wanted to only display relevant information. So I thought, well, I'll always display the tempo sync left. And then if the value is 0, I will display delay left time msec. If the value is 1, I will display delay left time note. And I ended up, the first version that I wrote, which was initially in Windows Forms, and then I ported that to WPF, initially had that as a really general thing where the one field could be conditional on any other field. It had to be a numeric field, but any other field anywhere else in the schema. And you would say, well, only display this field if that other field has value 10 or whatever it was. And when I did a rewrite to use WPF, hopefully more reasonably, I'll come on to things I've learned in a bit. Getting the condition stuff, most of the rest of the WPF, the new WPF app, felt a lot cleaner. But the condition stuff was really hard to work out because you've got to resolve fields all over the place and you don't necessarily know when you start doing things how they resolve. It's all tricky. And then I noticed something, which was I was only using this functionality for tempo sync fields. So sometimes it was a delay time as milliseconds and sometimes it was hertz, but it was always a switch on or off, a fixed time-based thing, and then a musical note-based thing. And these three fields would always be absolutely together. And I then thought, well, how about I just special case that kind of field and say this is now a single field that is 12 bytes long instead of 3 4-byte fields. And I can then special case how that is displayed, and it can know which thing to do. So I started with something that was massively general and found it hard to implement, and ended up doing something much more specific. And it sort of feels bad. You feel bad when you do, here's a little special case thing. And I'm starting to learn to feel less bad about doing that because it can be really, really useful. Okay, next thing's about the schema. One thing I could do is take the schema, and currently I load it at execution time. Instead of that, I could write a code generator to generate view models and models. And I've decided that's probably too hard, basically. Writing code generators is a big imposition, big commitment. So I made the decision that I'm fairly happy with, just to load the JSON, which is an embedded resource. It's fine. But then comes tricky bits. I knew that I liked immutability, and immutable types in C#. They're getting better in C# 9 as of November. But they have this bit of trickiness. It feels like they should be immutable because an object schema, sorry, the schema for a module does not change over time. Whatever changes I make on the kit itself, that doesn't change what the schema looks like. So it is naturally immutable. But then comes the actual implementation. So should a schema know what fields are in it? That feels like a bit of an obvious, well, yeah, what is a schema if it doesn't know what its fields are? Okay. Should a field know what schema it is within? Doesn't have to, but it makes it really handy if it does, because then it makes it easier for one field to refer to another. It can say, okay, I will navigate up to my parent container and then down to the instrument or whatever, so that I can find out what I should do. There are lots of benefits in a field knowing its schema. But it turns out that having both of those is really difficult, because if these are immutable, then when you construct the field, you have to give it the schema that it's part of, because it can't change afterwards. But the schema can't have been created yet, because it would need to know the fields. It needs to be past the fields that it's going to be representing. So the way of doing this, there are two approaches here, and I've got a sort of hybrid. One is, it is immutable, so long as you're not within the same assembly. So I have various things that have internal setters and public getters, and I think I document, this does not change after initial schema construction. But it makes it really easy to say, okay, well, I'll load everything and then fix stuff up. And then after that fix up, nothing's going to change. That's really easy. The other thing to do is you leak the this during the constructor. To be clear about that, you call a schema, module schema constructor, and that creates fields and passes the this reference from the module schema into the fields when it's constructing it. And that way you can have this cycle. But it does mean that if the field constructor calls something on the module schema that hasn't yet been set up, stuff could go wrong. So it makes things a little bit more brittle in terms of, you need to get the ordering right, and all the benefits that you get from immutability. You know, I know that this won't change. Well, it might change if your code is executing during the construction. So I don't have great answers there, other than immutability is hard. Keep things, keep any local mutability as tightly constrained as you can, and be aware, if you can control construction and control everything that you are constructing, then you can be careful in this way. I've talked about overlays and conditions a bit, and then in terms of reinventing the wheel, it's possible that there are applications that already exist that can take a schema in their own format and give me pretty much what I've got as my drum kit controller with no extra effort. I don't know of such a one, but I'm sure they would exist. But it wouldn't have been fun anyway. So I didn't mind too much reinventing the wheel, but it's good to know about it. I will show some of the code in a minute, in particular a few of the WPF bits. I haven't shown both Kit Explorer and Module Explorer, partly because that's slightly tricky to do on Zoom. But I have this idea of, you either run the whole of, you look at the whole of the drum module, all 100 kits, and you can save that to a VDrum file, or you can have a single kit because you may want to email just one kit from one person to another, or have a kit that sometimes you want as kit number 50 and sometimes you want as kit number 60, and it's handy to have this as a unit of savability and a unit of editing, so you don't have to load the whole of a module in order to just edit a kit. But that looks very, very similar to editing the whole module. It's just sort of a bit further down the tree view. So there are some differences. How can I best express those differences whilst having as little duplication as possible? So I could definitely have copied the XAML for Kit Explorer and Module Explorer. And in fact, that's how I started with Kit Explorer. I took my Module Explorer, which is the first thing I wrote, copied it to Kit Explorer, changed Kit Explorer to do the right thing. And then when I knew these two things that were similar, what they looked like, then I could work out the commonality and the differences. And this is a little bit like normal inheritance. You know, if you've got two things that feel like, well, they want to be two different classes, but how much do I want to inherit from an abstract base class? Well, don't start off with that abstract base class. Instead, start off with two separate concrete classes. It's really easy to develop then. You don't need to worry about inheritance and overriding and all kinds of nastiness. You know, copy paste. I say this a lot and I don't actually get flack for it, but I get some raised eyebrows. Copy paste is a great way of doing code reuse. It's particularly great as a first piece of code reuse, so that you can explore the domain a bit more. So copy things, change what you need to, because you don't necessarily know what you'll need to change beforehand, then compare, and you can say, okay, well, these things are in common and these things are different. So I've ended up with a single XAML file, but two different view models that inherit from a base abstract view model. And to be honest, there are some hacks, like I have an isKitExplorer property so that I can conditionally include bits of user interface into the general data explorer based on whether this is a kit or whether it's a module explorer. I have a few hacks in the WPF. There are just a few things that I couldn't really work out how to do with view models. So my first WPF version didn't have view models at all. It created all the controls itself, and it was ghastly. I got to the stage where basically this was unmaintainable and I needed to start from scratch. So for a long time, for a few months, I ran with both code bases, and the great thing when you start from scratch, you can reconsider some of your choices around the schema. So my schema is now significantly simpler to write than it used to be. But I thought, I'm going to try to do this properly in terms of WPF, have almost no logic in the view, and everything's within the view model. And I also said, I'm going to try to do this without any third-party libraries. Not because I think the third-party libraries are bad or anything like that, but I wanted to know what they would be doing for me, so that I could then make the choice of, okay, well, I seem to have reinvented the wheel in so many different ways now. Turns out, I really haven't. I have two things that I would have got from Caliburn Micro or whatever. One is a view model base class, which all it knows about is it's got a set property method that knows how to raise iNotify property changed. And it also has the idea of knowing whether there are any other subscribers to you. So if I've got one view model that needs to respond to changes from another view model, then I only want to subscribe to those changes when someone subscribes to my changes, because otherwise you can end up having garbage collection issues where you've got subscriptions to events which you don't need anymore because nothing else is going to monitor whether this one changes and things. Event handling ends up with references in interesting directions, basically. So I took that idea of view model base And the other thing I had is a delegate command, so a WPF I command implementation that's basically execute this delegate when you get called, and maybe a bit of conditionality there. I'll come back to the other interesting view and view model interaction. A little bit about installers and certificates. I'm writing a Windows app. It's on GitHub, and if I can't remember whether the location is already in the chat. If it's not, I'm just adding this here now, Jon Skeet demo code. So it's in there in the drums folder. And it was always going to be open source, so I can blog about it, and that's half the point. But it turns out that there are some people who genuinely find this useful, and shipping zip files around and things ends up being kind of nasty. So I thought, well, the point of this is to learn, so why don't I learn a bit about Windows installers? And I found a video by, I think he's called Angel 6 or 6 Angels, one of the two. I think it's Angel 6, which ran me through building a Wix installer. I had to tweak a few things. There were some warnings and stuff that I didn't need or whatever, but that was enough to get an installer. And then I tried running the installer on a different machine, and it said, oh, you really don't want to do this. No, you so don't want to do this. Windows is very, very stubborn about not running installers from untrusted sources. And I understand why. Bit frustrating for me, but okay, let's continue this learning journey. And it turns out that I needed a personal certificate, something that could say, yeah, this code really is written by Jon Skeet. And then it's up to you whether you trust code that's written by Jon Skeet. I wouldn't trust it at all, to be honest. It's terrible code, but leaving that aside. So how do I get a certificate? Turns out this isn't as simple as it is to get a Let's Encrypt HTTPS or SSL certificate. You need to pay some money and then pay some more money to someone else. So you go to a certificate company and say, I wish to buy this 3-year certificate, whatever. And they say, yep, that's fine. Okay, now you need to prove who you are. You need to go to an authorized notary locally and take your birth certificate and passport and proof of address and proof of life and proof of everything. So you get all that paperwork together and you find a notary. You then go in person. Fortunately, this was back when it was easy to do in person. And he checks through everything, puts his stamp on, and then sends things off, and then you pay him some money. So this is all quite an expensive process. And finally, you get a certificate, and you then need to work out how to make that part of your build system. And finally, I have an installer, hooray, that when you try installing it, if one of you tries to install it now, because again, these are all available via GitHub releases, it will say, rather than, oh, you definitely shouldn't run this, it says, well, you should only run this if you trust Jon Skeet. I don't know about this. I've heard bad things about him. It doesn't quite say that, but there's this idea of trust, in fact, that the more people who do install it and don't report anything wrong with it, the more Windows will let it just install without, it will do a little bit of a, are you sure you want to install something? But it doesn't say, are you really sure you want to install it? So learning about that was kind of interesting. I will now shift to Visual Studio just so I can show one bit of code. I would normally have, I like to show lots and lots of code in this talk, but today apparently not so much. So I'm going to shift to Visual Studio and stop it from running and just show one example of something that I don't know whether it's a hack or not. I have all kinds of different projects, and I apologize, I'm going to bump the font up where I can, but I can't bump the font up for the Solution Explorer easily. I think there are ways of doing it, but it's always slightly tricky. So that's bumped the main font up. So, but hopefully you can see I've got a GUI project and a view model project and a model project. I've got lots and lots of projects. How do I communicate if the view model So I'm on the Explorer, the home screen, and I want to load a file. Okay, that load file command, all the logic for it is in the view model, as it should be, but we need to pop up an open file dialog. And then when someone's chosen the file, we're back to the view model and we want to do some logic. And then depending on whether it's a kit or a module or an instrument bank, which I haven't talked about, we want to do different things. Now, I don't want to put any logic into the view model that says open a file dialog, because that's a view concern. So how does this seems to be the view model asking the view for something instead of the view asking for the view model for something. So the way I have done it is I have this iView services interface, and this is everything the view model has to ask the view to do for us. So two common things are showing an open file dialog and showing a save file dialog. And then there are things about showing the different kinds of Explorer windows and some other dialogues and various things like that. And then the implementation of that is in the GUI project. And each of these is fairly simple, but these are all view-based concerns. And the hope is that then if I were to write view model tests, I could then have my own fake implementation that says, oh yes, I've shown a save file dialog. This is the file that someone said to save. And then I potentially want to also mock out loading the file or saving the file, but that's a slightly separate matter. As it happens, I haven't written many tests at all. I do have a few, in fact, not in the view model at all. I've got a very few in the model project. So I check that I can load all the schemas, and I have various different schemas. But one interesting thing I found is this project, I normally do write unit tests and integration tests fairly conscientiously, but in this particular case, the whole code base has been changing so quickly and in fairly significant ways. I'm now at the stage where I feel I could write some tests and it would be useful. Previously, they would have mostly slowed me down. They would have found some bugs that did take time to fix, definitely, but they would mostly have just slowed me down instead. So that is the code. We're kind of at time-ish, and my voice is starting to go as it usually does about this stage in the proceedings. I will just make one small change, which I had to do because the VDrum Explorer always assumes you only have a single instrument attached, which is entirely reasonable in most cases. But as it happens, I have a second instrument. This is a VDrum Explorer that is meant to be for drums, but it so happens that I bought myself a digital saxophone that arrived on Tuesday. And if I start the, in fact, I'll stop sharing so you can see it. So this is what's called an Aerophone. And this uses the same protocol, and this was precisely the reason for getting it. I'm not a saxophone player any more than I'm slightly more of a drum player than a saxophone player, which shows you just how bad a saxophone player I am. But when I was giving this talk 2 weeks ago to, Leeds maybe, I can't remember. I said, well, Roland may well sell instruments that that use the same protocol that aren't drums. And I was fairly sure that it did so for pianos, but I've already got a digital piano and it's a Yamaha one. But I got off the treadmill the other day. I tried to do a 5K walk or run every day. And I thought, I'm going to have a look on the Roland website to see whether there are any other instruments. And it so happens that the Aerophone fits the bill. So, this is something a bit like a saxophone. It's currently, this will sound a bit more saxophone-like. If this were a real saxophone, I suspect that would sound significantly worse. But you can change it to sound like all kinds of different things. Let me find one of my favorite ones. So you can make it sound a bit like a cello. That does sound vaguely like strings. Or even better, I should really remember where this is. You could make it sound like a pipe organ. And there's a brilliant video of someone called, I think his name is Alistair Purnell, playing Bach's Toccata and Fugue on the Aerophone. He's the world's expert on the Aerophone. But as you'll have sort of guessed, you can configure this to sound like different instruments, and it's not quite the same as the kit, because I have one thing to blow as opposed to several things to hit. However, this one thing to blow has 4 different options for instruments, and it looks a bit like this. So if I just run the code, I will start sharing the screen when I've got something that's useful to see. So having sort of given the TD27 a different module identifier, it will now identify just the Aerophone. And I can load a kit. Right, so I'll now share the screen again. So share the Kit Explorer. Okay, so this is now the Aerophone, and this is a single kit on it. And you can see this one has an alto sax, a soprano sax, which is off, a tenor sax, and a baritone sax. So everything apart from the alto sax is off. And when I click on test settings, which this button didn't exist when I woke up this morning, because the Aerophone has 100 user kits, 129 preset kits, and it's got what's called the temporary kit, which is what you happen to be playing at any time, which is like an edit buffer, and you need to save that back to a specific place. So that makes it quite easy to test things, because I just copy stuff over and then play something. So that's just the alto sax. And just to prove that this works, if I go into edit mode and change it, now the order of this is just terrible at the moment. There's no order in the order, as it were. But let's do a full strings. That might sound a bit different. Barely sounds at all. I don't know. I need to look at all these settings. Bear in mind, I've only had this instrument since Tuesday. But a grand pipe organ, that should sound a bit like it sounded before. So again, it's quite quiet at the moment. I probably want to bump up the level a bit. I can make it a bit lower by putting it down an octave. Okay, that's more work required on finding out what all the things do. But the point is, I got this on Tuesday. I had previously downloaded the documentation and written up a load of the schema, but I've already been finding out that there are things that are different on an Aerophone than on the kit. It doesn't actually document how to find the instruments, which is a bit annoying. Let me stop the screen share. So there's been a certain amount of reverse engineering. Some of the fields are in a slightly different format. Previously, every 16-bit field has been effectively a signed field, so with a value from -128 to +127. There is one field within the Aerophone that is effectively an unsigned field that goes over the course of 2 bytes. So, and then I've got the instruments are an enum field, where it's a 24-bit field, so it's across 3 bytes, which may not be quite right, but it kind of seems to work. This is where it being undocumented really doesn't help things. But because I've got this infrastructure that I can create the schema, and because I'm now in a position, things have been separated out a fair amount, I was able to hack stuff together knowing that I had this talk to give. I would probably otherwise have waited until the weekend, but I've accelerated things a little bit so that I could show you it working at all. And I think that's really exciting. I have had so much fun doing this project. You can see I've been learning things around what are different approaches to immutability, different approaches to GUI inheritance and regular inheritance. And basically, again, what I want you to go away with is John's been having a load of fun. What might you have fun with? So I think I'm probably, aside from anything else, it's getting very hot in here, which means I've been spouting too much hot air. Any questions before we sort of start wrapping things up?
If you've got questions for John, obviously feel free to unmute yourself. I think
hang on.
Permission's up. Turn the headset on, John.
Apologies, Mark. I couldn't hear you there. I could see you were saying things.
Oh, okay.
My speaker stops. It goes to sleep if it has any sound for half an hour. So if people have been saying things over the last half hour,
no,
yeah,
I've not heard anything except you, John.
Okay, good.
I guess what I would say was feel free to just ping something really quick in the chat if you want to ask John a question, and I'll unmute you and you can ask, because there's enough people on the call that we can actually manage that, I think. One quick question, John, while I'm waiting for other people to type from me. I know obviously .NET, C# is your thing, but have you looked at the MIDI access API as part of the new web APIs, which is an experimental API?
No, I haven't.
That would get around your deployment issues if you could do it in the browser, of course.
So that would be the browser talking to your local. That would mean writing JavaScript.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it would mean JavaScript or TypeScript, unfortunately. But
oh no, so
I wonder. Or you could do
Blazor.
Yeah,
I wonder. Oh, that's a really interesting idea.
You'd need a JavaScript bridge, I'd imagine, to you talk to the browser API, possibly.
I think the idea is that Blazor lets you talk to browser APIs. That's a spectacularly interesting idea. I would really like to, I think this weekend, I may try to get to the stage of small goals. I would like the browser to be able to say, you appear to have a TD27 connected, and here's the list of kits. That would be a significant step forward. Oh, that would be awesome.
So as I understand it, it's in Edge and it's in Chrome. It's not in Firefox. It is in Opera at the moment. It's experimental.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting, because currently it's in WPF, and one of the next things that I'm looking forward to doing is moving stuff into Maui when that comes. So I believe Maui is going to be experimental in .NET 5 and then stabilized by .NET 6. So that's multi-platform, and yeah, that should work. And hopefully, having separated out the view models and stuff, while I'm sure that doing all this in Blazor will require a certain amount of tweaking, and I'll do it in a new copy of things, at least I should be able to just say, right, don't want any of the view anymore. What do I need to do to get the view model and the model to still work? Take out the MIDI interface bit, and hopefully get all that separation nice and clean. It may not be entirely infeasible.
There's a few questions in the chat right now, Joe.
I was just seeing. Okay, easy one. What type of Yamaha digital piano? It is a P105, which is again probably more professional than I need. I mentioned privilege before. I'm privileged enough that when I buy something, if I can spend a bit more money and get something nice and high quality and not regret later on and think, oh, I wish I'd bought the high quality one, then I tend to do that. So I've had this for quite a while now, and it will always be good enough for me. I'm absolutely sure, but I spent probably a bit more than I needed to. Next question about knowable reference types, how I totally embrace that now. I've mostly embraced it in this, certainly, less so in my work projects. There's quite a big network effect effectively. So a lot of my work projects use protocol buffers and generated code from protocol buffers, and that doesn't understand nullable reference types. So that makes it really hard to try to, until everything you're using has embraced it, it's hard to get half the benefits. So node time, I converted to nullable reference types kind of immediately. And I just recently released node time 3, which the big difference is it supports nullable reference types and is annotated appropriately. In terms of problems encountered with NRTs, anything to do with generics just ends up being painful, because a little bit like dynamic, you can tell that NRTs were bolted on afterwards, and the team has done a great job of bolting them on well, but they're still bolted on. And so the type system doesn't fully understand it, and there are bits of generics where you say, well, I want you to have a nullable version of this, and it's, well, you either need to say that it's a reference type or it needs to be a struct, and then I can do the nullable of T. But I think the team's done a great job, but that doesn't mean it's a really smooth experience. I'm looking forward to writing about it in the new version of, next version of C# in depth, which I haven't tried yet, but which I haven't started yet, rather. But yes, it's not smooth, but I think it's worth doing. Hannah's asked, have I had more fun learning to play the drums or learning to code the drums? I regret to say learning to code the drums. I'm practicing every day and I'm getting better. What I really need to do is start playing along to songs rather than something called melodics, which I'm using, which is a little bit like Dance Dance Revolution type thing, where it shows you all the notes and whatever. I do also have what's called a Drumeo subscription, which I'm not using as much as I probably should do. It doesn't feel like I have much time, but I always manage to make time for coding, and time for practicing the drums is slightly harder. At some point, I need to start playing in our junior church band. My friend Alice is normally the drummer for us there, but sooner or later she might be away and I'll have to come in. But she's a really good drummer, so we'll find that the expectations of the rest of the band might be a little higher than I can actually satisfy. But it's certainly a lot of fun to do. I don't regret buying a drum kit at all. It's definitely been a great thing to do, but I've enjoyed the coding side even more. It sounds like that was all the questions. Oh no, what's my go-to song to drum along to? The only one I've really learned to any effect is Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer.
Oh, it's a great song.
It is a great song. The interesting thing there is technically is how I've been able to use the code to make that easier to drum along to. So I have the sheet music for Living on a Prayer, the drum sheet notation, courtesy of Drumeo, and it is 4 pages, and I can show 2 pages at a time in Acrobat Reader. But how do you switch from one to the other? Well, I have a little console app. I mentioned the console app earlier on. And what used to be an extra pad, can you see? Right, so there's a pad behind here. I've got a monitor there that's just for when I'm using melodics. And this pad is not one of your normal ones. And it was for turning the page. I now actually have a a bar trigger, which is more sensible. And the idea is when I run this console app, I say, press space whenever you hear me hitting the the bar trigger, which is something that I only do when I need to change the page. So, you know, it currently, I think that's probably some, yeah, it's a tom. But I could change it to either be silent or something that would be appropriate. But I'll be drumming away and just hit the thing, and then the page turns over, which is fantastic. And it's something that I would not have had. maybe there are apps there to do that for you, but I haven't seen it. It's not the kind of thing that you would ever pay for, but it's a really handy small use of, well, I know how to trigger stuff from MIDI, so therefore I might as well do that. There's also, I've written a Tetris clone that you control via the drum kit, which there's a video of on YouTube. If you search for Jon Skeet drums Tetris, you will find it. Strangely enough, there aren't too many hits for that. But yeah, once you say, well, I've got a MIDI controller, what can I do with it? You come up with all kinds of silly things, and it's so much fun. So think about what else you can do that's huge amounts of fun, that has no practical benefit other than being a bit of fun. And in fact, sometimes you'll find there is practical benefit. There are people who want to use the VDrum Explorer. They don't yet know that I've got a saxophone in there as well. But there can be practical upshots as well. And everything I've learned definitely has the practical upshot of maybe one day I'll need to write a Windows installer and get a certificate for my work stuff. Definitely things around designing schemas and just ways of thinking about different situations absolutely have professional ramifications. So the more you can get hobbies to feed into your professional life and your professional life to feed into your hobbies, while maintaining a really clear dividing line between the two. You don't want your hobby to feel like work, and if your work feels too much like a hobby, well, you need to be careful that you're still being professional. The lack of tests that I've got in the VDrum Explorer, I wouldn't get away with and wouldn't try to get away with for work. But the more they can feed off each other, you get a virtuous cycle, which is really good.
Oh, I'm pressing the unmute button, but it's not unmuting me. I was having a bit of a coughing fit in the background there, John. Sorry about that. That seems to be the end of the questions. Can I just say on behalf of everybody, massive thank you, John, for that. It's great to have something that you're really enthusiastic about as well. That's a bit of a passion for you as well.
Yeah, my pleasure.
There's a few thanks going up the chat, so I guess everybody's muted. I'll just reinforce that. We're really chuffed to have you on. And more information for everybody who's still on the call, will be coming soon about the sort of community project we're going to kick off in NETech. And actually, we're not going to define what there is, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we'd like to do, but I would love the community to actually sort of give us some ideas and collaborate on that.
Yeah.
I really quickly want to do a quick plug as well. David asked a question for David Glass. I know Sam Hogarth's on the call, who are running NERPC, which is their remote conference. So they run a version last month, and they're running again in September, which is back to school, I think it's called. David will probably correct me on that, or Sam might correct me on that. But it's all about, I think it's about like going back to school, learning something that you haven't learned before, or teaching. Or go to the NERPC website for that. So there's your plug, David, Sam. I want to thank John again. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming along and giving up your lunchtime, I guess. And I'll stop the recording and jump off. Thanks again, John.
Cool. Thank you. Nice to see you all, and hope to see you in person sometime in the future.